Hello everybody, welcome to CJJ's webinar on Youth with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in Juvenile Justice. My name is Jonathan Litt and I'm the Policy and Field Relations Associate at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Before I introduce today's distinguished speakers, I'd like to take a moment to discuss a few technical details. You will notice that all participants are and will remain muted throughout the webinar. Participants will answer questions at the end of the presentation. You may submit your questions by typing your questions into the questions box at any time throughout the webinar. You will also notice that there are two resources available for downloading under the Handouts menu option in your control panel. You can click a resource to download it. If you don't see the documents in your control panel, click the plus sign next to the Handouts in your control panel to drop down this menu option. We are recording this webinar. The recording, along with the slides, transcript, handouts, and additional resources will be posted on CJJ's website within 24 hours. With that, it's my honor to introduce today's speakers, Leanne Davis and Diane Smith-Howard. Leanne Davis is the Program Manager on Justice Initiatives for the ARC's Program and Innovations Group, and in that role oversees the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. She has worked in the area of disability and justice issues since 1994, when she was hired by the ARC of the United States to direct a Department of Justice project of national significance educating criminal justice professionals about the American Disabilities Act accommodations. Since that time, she has authored numerous publications during her almost 20 years with the ARC, covering topics related to criminal justice and victimization issues, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and the ethics of genetic research. She has presented both nationally and internationally regarding criminal justice and disability issues and provided congressional testimony on the delivery of law enforcement services to people with developmental disabilities under Title II of the ADA. Ms. Davis serves on SAMHSA's Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Disorder Center for Excellence expert panel and currently serves as a consultant for the Office of Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center, Vera Institute of Justice, and the Disability and Abuse Project. As a sexual abuse survivor who was shocked to discover the high rate of violence among people with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience, she is passionate about ensuring victims with disabilities obtain justice and healing, and that criminal justice professionals are provided effective, ongoing training to adequately serve people with disabilities, whether victim, suspect, or offender. Diane Smith-Howard, a litigator with 20 years of experience in juvenile and education law. Diane's worked at the National Disability Rights Network, focusing on conditions for youth in the juvenile justice system and child welfare system. In addition, she works on issues related to adults with disabilities in the criminal justice system and children and youth with disabilities that impact behavior in the public education system. Diane provides training and technical assistance to the Protection and Advocacy Network on these issues. She has worked with the National Disability Rights Network, Maine and Michigan affiliates, providing direct services to clients. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Leanne.
All right, thank you, Jonathan, and I really appreciate the Coalition for Juvenile Justice taking time to have a webinar on such an important topic today, and I'm just very excited to participate in this. And for next slide, I just want to give you a little bit of overview of who the ARC is, because many of you on the call today may not be familiar with the ARC. And we're the largest national community organization advocating for and serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We serve all ages of people with more than 100 different diagnoses, including autism, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and Fragile X syndrome. And we cover a number of different issues, including education and healthcare, employment, housing, and also criminal justice. And that has really been where my area has focused on over the past 20 years. and why we created the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, which is next slide, please. What the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability is a BJA-funded training and technical assistance center. So BJA is the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and through this grant we are able to provide information referral and technical assistance. We also have a website that includes a number of different resources listed by state and by topic. We are creating a legislative database looking at various legislation impacting this community specifically. We offer a webinar program and have been developing publications, including our Pathways to Justice training program. Next slide, please. And I think what really brings us to this issue today, and one of the things that many of you have been working on, is the umbrella of criminal justice reform. And we have such a unique opportunity right now, bipartisan efforts, to really look at how to reform our criminal justice system. We know that there's too many people in the system, and we're often looking for alternatives to sentencing. And we feel like this population in particular is one that we need to focus on in looking at what are the alternatives specifically for people with different types of cognitive disabilities. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with President Obama's announcing the ban on using solitary confinement for juveniles. And he said that especially for juveniles and people with mental illness, this can have the potential to lead to devastating consequences. And in this talk of criminal justice reform, we just want to ensure that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are included in this discussion. Next slide. And I just want to, and I will get into what specifically IDD is, but before we get there, I want to give you a story of Paul Gordo, who is pictured on this slide, and with full permission from his family and him to provide this story, because right now they are fighting for his son to stay out of the system. And this is an 18-year-old with autism who had a meltdown in a library in Monterey, California. And what happened is he ended up running into an elderly woman who then ended up having a concussion. He was then charged with felony assault, and even though the court system, the attorneys were made aware that he has autism and that people with autism are prone to outbursts and meltdowns and can have aggressive behavior, that didn't change in any way how this case was being looked at. And his defense attorney notes that because of his disability, he didn't form an intent to commit this act. So he wasn't in awareness of what he was doing or that he could potentially harm someone. He was simply in the fight or flight mode and running out of the library. So I think this just is a good example of how we need to look at balancing this need in society, the victim's needs versus the need for justice for people with disabilities as well. And how do we learn how to balance that when both of these things are equally important? Next slide. And that's really where NCCJD has a goal of building the capacity of the criminal justice system to be able to respond to these sort of difficult cases where there's gaps in existing services for people with disabilities like Paul. And we're really focusing on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities specifically. Next slide. And in order to do this in a way that brings all people to the table, we have invited a number of partners to work with us. And that includes some of the names that you see here. And what this slide is showing is a collage of different logos of agencies who have been working with NCCJD. And we really feel like it's important whenever we're working on criminal justice or juvenile justice issues around people with IDD, that we have policing involved, the legal community, victim advocates, and disability agencies. Next slide. And because we don't have time to get into the deeper details of some of the things we'll be addressing in the webinar today, I did want to make sure that you are aware of some of the resources that we can currently offer. And we have a white paper on juvenile justice issues, which is one of your handouts for today. So I encourage you to look at that a little bit more closely after the webinar. Next slide. But for today, we're going to focus on these discussion points because many of you on the webinar may not be as familiar with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we're going to look at an overview of that. One of the difficulties, too, is just knowing how to identify it, since many people with IDD are not easily, don't have characteristics where you could easily point someone out. And it would actually take more of an effort on your part to ask some questions and to try to find out if the disability does exist. And then understanding how having that type of a disability can actually increase juvenile justice involvement. And then looking at a promising practice and how to provide alternatives for individuals like this. Next slide. And some of the research points out that 65 to 70% of justice-involved youth do have a disability, and we know that that is 3 times higher the rate compared to youth without disabilities. And also, speaking specifically about people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we know that 60% of people with FASD over the age of 12 have been charged with a crime. And for those who are not familiar with FASD, that is what occurs when a mother drinks when she's pregnant, and it can cause a range of effects, including physical, mental, behavioral, and or learning disabilities, which have lifelong implications. And we see quite a bit of people, quite a number of people and youth who have FASD going into the criminal justice system. Next. So what we still need to know regarding this population is how many youth in the juvenile justice system are diagnosed with intellectual or developmental disabilities. How do we create a screening tool or a protocol for juveniles with ID to be identified? And then I think one of the most important questions we need to think about is, even if we could identify every single juvenile in the system with IDDs, what services or supports or accommodations are going to be most effective? And this really leads me to the next story I wanted to talk about. Next slide. And this is Justin's story. And we've been working with a documentary filmmaker, and her name is Karen Graw, and she's been working in the area of developing different documentaries around juvenile justice her entire career for over 20 years. And while she was doing some film work on one of the documentaries she was working on, she actually came across Justin and realized that clearly he was different, that it didn't seem like he was in the right place. And that really started a long saga of her working directly with him and trying to find a more appropriate place for Justin. So this is on the slide right now is a picture of him wearing a green shirt with a slight smile. And this is at age 14 when he first entered the juvenile justice system. Next slide. And now I'd like to show you a picture of Justin much later, pictured there with Karen Graw, who did the documentary. And I just wanted to point out some things that she learned along the way that is included in our white paper. She said that while I wasn't at the prison this particular day to meet or film with Justin, I was transfixed, and I wanted to find out more. the prison superintendent told me Justin had an IQ of 40 and couldn't read or write, he was furious Justin ever made his way from the courts to the prison in the first place. He also told me this: the prison's mental health unit had become a sort of dumping ground for the courts, a place where kids with disabilities were being sentenced when the courts felt there was nowhere else to put them. And then she also mentioned that she understands that Justin isn't alone. Over the past 6 years of filming his story, she learned of a disproportionate number of children with disabilities in the juvenile justice system, and that many, just like Justin, were abused at home, they were pushed out of schools due to disciplinary reasons, or they were inappropriately placed by the courts in punitive environments where they didn't get the education that they needed, and this often led them to even deeper commitments into the criminal justice system later in life. Next slide. So this is just another example of why it's so important to look at specific stories like these that really point out the gaps in the system for juveniles with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And what I'm showing now is a picture of that model that shows different stages through the criminal justice system, and all the way from first contact through investigation to jail to trial, plea agreement, transition, and community. And this is really helpful when looking at whether it's someone's story or in a community where there are gaps still taking place. And for example, for Justin, in that first box that's colored purple under first contact, we can see where if his disability might have been, if his disability once identified, if they could have provided accommodations earlier, he could have not had to stay in the system as long as he did. And so this is an important thing to keep in mind and a tool to use in order to keep people out of the system whenever possible. Next slide. And in the training that we provide on disability issues, this is called Pathways to Justice, what we do is start out by providing a disability overview. And so I'd like to take a quick poll question from the audience today and find out which disability out of these different disabilities listed that you think may be the most prevalent in the criminal justice system. If it's, first of all, intellectual disability where there's no specific type of diagnosis, or if it's autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, dual diagnosis where there's both an intellectual or developmental disability along with a mental illness, or if you think it's Down syndrome. So we'll give you a second to respond to that. And so you can see here, in looking at the results, we have quite a high number of people that said dual diagnosis. The next was intellectual disability with no specific diagnosis, then FASDs, and then autism spectrum disorder. So the actual answer is that we don't know for sure, which that probably doesn't surprise you. There was actually a study that Bureau of Justice Statistics study that came out in December 2015 that looked at different types of disabilities among prison and jail inmates, but they categorized the disability as physical and cognitive. And in that cognitive category, it was very broad. They were looking at difficulty concentrating or remembering or making decisions as the way of defining cognitive. So I wanted to bring this out to point to the need of having better research so that we can start to tell just how many people with these different types of disabilities are involved in the system. And I did give away some of the answer when talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders earlier when I mentioned that 60% of people with FASD age 12 and over were charged with a crime. So we know that there's quite a high number of people with FASDs in the system. And then also dual diagnosis is another one of those categories where we see a high number as well. Next slide. We also use a chart where we can better explain the different types of disabilities to whether it's criminal justice or juvenile justice, professionals who are not as familiar with disability. And basically, on this chart, we have sort of like a flow chart, and we have the physical and the brain-based separated into two categories. And in physical, there can be a number of different types, from heart disease to deaf or hard of hearing to blind or low vision. And then when you look down at the brain-based, that goes into three categories that include mental illness, dual diagnosis, and developmental. And for the training that we're looking at and what we are talking about today, our focus is on intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, FASDs, and other different types of developmental disabilities. Next slide. And I'm going to go through some of these a little bit more quickly just to point to more of an understanding of disability more broadly. Again, this first webinar is to give you sort of a foundation of the different types of intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so on this one slide here is just a visual of the different types of developmental disabilities that people can have. And then out of those, how many people actually have an intellectual and developmental disability. And so you can see that, for example, for Down syndrome, most people with Down syndrome do have an intellectual disability, whereas with autism spectrum disorders, a person may have autism but yet still not have intellectual disability. And it would be important to know this because it helps people understand how to provide the right type of accommodation. Next slide. One thing to really point out is how often intellectual disability is hidden. So most people have a mild form of intellectual disability, and they look no different from other people. And this can actually lead to more severe consequences in the system. Also, while some people with IDD do not have physical characteristics, such, for example, Down syndrome, many people are still hard to recognize. And when they come into the criminal justice system, it makes it that much more difficult to understand that they need any accommodation at all. And when cases like these go to court, it's hard to convince a jury or attorneys, people in the court system who don't have any idea about disabilities that one does exist and that accommodations are needed. Next slide. These are just some general signs of intellectual and developmental disability to be aware of. And I'd just like to highlight the second bullet that says easily influenced and eager to please others. I think that one is especially important to keep in mind. We've seen in several cases that they may try to run away in police presence or become upset. We mentioned earlier the fight or flight response and how that can lead to much deeper involvement in the system. Next slide. And as suspects offenders, they may say on that second bullet, say what they think officers want to hear in the effort to hide their disability. And at the bottom there, I wanted to point out what many of you have probably seen, the Making a Murderer series that is on Netflix. And Brendan Dassey, who is involved in that case, who has clearly intellectual and developmental disabilities, how his confession was coerced, and how often this kind of thing is happening to people and juveniles with IDD. And Laura Nyrider is his attorney, and she mentions that that false confessions by juveniles are incredibly common. And when you put together someone who's a juvenile plus the fact that they have an intellectual disability, you can see where this increases the chance much more of giving a false confession. Next slide. And in determining disability, there's some things you can ask the individual, or look in records and try to figure out if a disability does exist. And one would be, for example, did the person attend special ed classes? Did they receive any financial assistance? Do they carry any kind of card? These are some of the things we do training, whether it's police officers, attorneys, victim advocates, to just help people get an idea of how do you tell if someone does in fact have some type of disability. Next slide. And some of the common IDDs that we provide in our training is autism. And instead of going over these one by one, I just would like to direct you to our website, where we do have a fact sheet on each one of these, where we point out different types of characteristics of people with different types of intellectual disabilities, and then accommodations that you can use. So next slide. We have one on Down syndrome. Next slide. And fetal alcohol spectrum disorder as well. And for the next slide, I do want to point out that in looking at FASD, one of the reasons why the risk is so high is because of the lack of impulse control that many times these youth and adults with FASD have. And another bullet on there is the poor judgment skills that we see over and over, and how this really kind of creates just the perfect storm for someone with an FASD once they get involved in the system. And I noted there that in Canada, they actually have, with their Lethbridge Regional Police Service, they train FASD justice officers specifically to support youth with FASD because of the overwhelming number of cases that they're getting of youth that have some kind of alcohol induced brain damage. Next slide. And so I think what we need to keep in mind, and this is a great point that in NCCJD's webinar that we brought up on juvenile justice issues, that what we haven't done yet is to identify how intellectual and developmental disability impacts a youth's entrance into the justice system, or how it should be considered to establish effective interventions. And so this is really the key question that we want to really focus on. And next slide. And the fact that there are interventions going on. One example is the ARC of the Capital Area's Family and Juvenile Transition Services in Austin, Texas. They've been providing this service and trying to really focus in on the community and on the juveniles in the community that have disabilities. So the goal of their program is to prevent involvement in the system and reduce recidivism. And their focus is on students aged 11 to 17. And they also hope to reduce the high dropout rate for teens with IDD. So their goal in doing this and how they're doing this is by providing case management, advocacy, and support to those who are at risk, but also they support those who are already in the system. And out of those served, 94% remained in school or working, and then 79% did not offend or reoffend. So they do have some numbers to show that by providing some kind of support, whether they're at risk to get in the system or those already in, and providing those in the community, that there can be some great outcomes. So I've just sort of given you an overview, a very quick overview, and now I believe Diane is going to go a little bit more in depth into some of these specific topic areas.
Well, thank you, Leanne. This is Diane Smith-Howard. I'm a senior staff attorney with the National Disability Rights Network. I'm going to start here on slide 31. And so next slide, please. Thank you. It's interesting, Leanne, you had raised the question of what do we know about how it is that youth with intellectual disabilities enter the system. And I'm going to be presenting on our report, the National Disability Rights Center's report, Orphanages, Training Schools, Reform Schools, and Now This, which is included as one of the handouts for this webinar. And that report will answer that question to some degree. We do know something about how this happens and how to prevent it. What we don't have at this time, I think, is a significant body of peer-reviewed research which I think would be very helpful to have as we go forward. We do know that overall juvenile incarceration rates are down, but yet a number of youth with disabilities remain incarcerated for a number of reasons, and that they are disproportionately represented in the incarceration population. Youth from particular, next slide. Youth from particular racial and ethnic groups and youth with disabilities are incarcerated at disproportionately high rates. That 65 to 70% of youth in the justice system meet the criteria for a disability. And this is particularly interesting as a fact because so many youth know once they're in the system not to report that they have a disability because it is not perceived as safe in the juvenile justice incarceration system to be seen as having a weakness of any kind. And so a youth who even knows, some youth don't know that they have disabilities, and even those who do know to downplay that in the system. So the fact that we have such high numbers probably means that those numbers actually in practical effect are even higher. It was interesting, I saw the poll that Leanne had provided on for slide 17 on prevalence in the system, and it's interesting because in our research we've determined that a fair number of youth with developmental disabilities in the juvenile justice system are actually on the autism spectrum disorder. And if you notice the prevalence data provided within the general population of people is ASD is about 40%, and I think anecdotally that's closer to what we're seeing in terms of kids who are in the system. Another thing that happens, I think, when we talk about juvenile justice and disability is to think about individuals as though they can have only one factor that can cause difficulty for them. And the reality is that many of these youth are members, if you were to draw the Venn diagrams, of a number of different subpopulations of vulnerability. So it is not uncommon for a youth with an intellectual or developmental disability to also be a youth with mental health needs, to also be within the child welfare system. In fact, children with disabilities are extremely disproportionately represented within the child welfare system and also within the juvenile justice system. So those are some very overlapping circles there. In addition, they are also disproportionately youth of color and disproportionately male. So race and gender are also issues. So when we talk about these youth, we had to think about them in terms of all of the groups that they are a part of, not just intellectual and developmental disability and all the vulnerabilities that thereby creates. In addition, another 75% of youth in the juvenile justice system have experienced trauma and victimization, leaving them at risk for mental health disorders such as PTSD. PTSD is very common. Next slide. As Leanne pointed out, one of the things that the ARCS program looks at is people with intellectual disabilities and their status as victims. And so the combination of being both victim and also perpetrator creates an additional layer of complexity when putting together treatment programming and thinking about what services they might benefit from. Next slide. So I'm speaking on behalf of the National Disability Rights Network. We are the national membership organization of the PNA network. There is a protection advocacy agency in each state and territory. There are 57 total, and one also that serves the Native American tribes of the Southwest. We serve individuals with disabilities from birth to death, and also all different types of disabilities, not just intellectual and developmental disabilities, serving thousands of individuals per year. And one of the things that prompted us to do this report is the number of cases that have come in through our intake system involving individuals with disabilities in the juvenile and criminal justice systems, that these are systems that are increasingly being used to serve people with disabilities, perhaps to replace some of the hospital and other institutional settings that have since closed. And so that's why we felt a need to focus on it. And I'd like to take a moment right now to really appreciate the work that CJJ and the ARC are doing on this very important issue, because we really do see this as a burgeoning problem and a significant area of focus. Next slide. I'm going to talk quickly about diversion. The report that you see in front of you is divided into 3 sections: diversion, conditions, and reentry. The diversion of children and youth with disabilities from the juvenile justice system is tremendously important, and as we set out in the report, it tends to be related to the failure of other systems to meet the needs of youth. I think, as Leanne mentioned earlier, in the two case examples, in both examples, these were kids who just didn't seem like they ought to be in the juvenile justice system, and one wonders how they got there. And typically that is because of a failure within the educational system or the failure to provide community mental health, for training of law enforcement officers so that children get arrested when they don't need to be, and the failure of the child welfare system to provide appropriate services. And I want to make sure that I say very clearly that not all communities and not all programs, of course, have these problems, and being the PNA network, we only see the situations where there are problems. So that is why our report is problem-focused. But we do see significant issues when service systems fail to provide the services that kids need, and then they end up in the juvenile justice system by default. Another thing that we have noticed increasingly is that as other service doors have closed, in some communities, families are required to have their children arrested to get them into the system, to get services that used to be available through either community mental health services or through the child welfare system. So in the past, states that, for example, might have used a CHINS petition, a child in need of services, to get services for a child, those children now have to come in through the juvenile justice system. And if the service system uniformly provided the services that these kids needed, that might work well. But what we see is that once children with disabilities enter the system, they do not receive the services that they need uniformly, and they also stay in the system longer. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. Next slide. Conditions. One of the things that the Protection Advocacy Network does is we have special access authority that allows us and actually mandates us to monitor the facilities where people with disabilities are served. And one of the places, of course, is our juvenile justice group homes and institutional settings. So when we are in there doing our monitoring, we tend to see the failure to provide necessary substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, health care, and education, inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion, and the failure to provide psychotropic medication, the overuse of segregation and solitary confinement, and even just really basic stuff like growing adolescents who don't receive enough nutrition, enough calories to maintain their weight, space, exercise, bed coverings, insects, that kind of thing, just traditional conditions issues, the failure to accommodate youth with disabilities, even those with physical disabilities who may not be in a wheelchair accessible setting, and very importantly, I think the failure to protect youth with disabilities from physical and sexual abuse by peers and staff. We receive an enormous number of complaints about physical and sexual abuse of vulnerable youth with disabilities who perhaps shouldn't even be in the facility in the first place, and now that they're there are not being adequately protected. So sometimes we see a vicious cycle where youth with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities, have to be referred to the juvenile justice system to get services, and once they're in the system, they're not receiving those services, the services that their families thought they would receive when they had them arrested. So there's a very significant issue in this area. And we, as the PNAs, handle an enormous number of individual and systemic cases about conditions. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, so I'm going to move rather quickly through the next section, but I think it's tremendously important, particularly for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Some states have implemented models where they look at the reentry needs of youth as they enter the system. So instead of waiting until the child has served his or her time and is ready to leave the system and go back to the community, they begin a process of individualized reentry programming from the beginning. And that's tremendously important because children entering the system may have had service lack to begin with, and certainly while they're in the system, they can benefit from educational services, transition and vocational planning services, services to ensure that they have Medicaid access when they leave the system if they need that in order to get mental health services, and that other entire package. And one of the things that studies have shown is that Youth do best when they re-enter, when they have a clear residential plan, who they'll live with and with whom, meaningful and respected involvement of the youth, because the youth obviously will be more interested in accessing the services that they are brought into and believe in. Receiving school placement. PNAs see an enormous number of cases where youth who come out of the juvenile justice system are rejected by their sending school districts upon return. So not only is there a stigma problem coming out of the juvenile justice system, and the fact that the youth have lost contact with family and community and positive peers, and in some cases the church community and other positive things, they have been replaced by negative peers, and when they come out of the program, they are also not back in school. So they have free time, they're roaming the streets, and they have lost contact with those positive peers during the time that they're out. A continuation of mental health and medical abuse treatment, and for youth with an IEP, IDA, transition planning. And I think for any youth, some element of employment planning or post-secondary outcome planning while they're in the system. From a very practical standpoint, PNAs have discovered that some educational programs for youth in the juvenile justice system do not provide high school credit. Now that tends to not be the case in the large juvenile justice detention centers, but it is more often the case in smaller settings like group homes where adjudicated youth may be placed by the state. They may attend school, but when they come out, do not receive credit for the time that they attended school. And of course, that can be very disheartening for kids and help, with the process of disengagement from the educational program. So we think that credit-bearing activity during credit-bearing educational program that results in transferable high school credit by a certified teacher is tremendously important, regardless of where that child is placed, whether they're in a detention center or if they're in a more informal community-based setting. We have a couple of quick recommendations that we wanted to go over. I talked about reentry programming, making sure that states have good quality individualized reentry programming is really the most important thing, educational services and therapeutic services. In addition, because so many of these kids, particularly kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities, come into the juvenile justice system as a result of a school-based arrest, we believe that schools should not be allowed to use federal funds to employ school resource officers, and that those school districts should use MOUs that do have school resource officers to limit their use to traditional police activities and train those SROs in those cases where it seems as though there are very high arrest rates at school and that may be a conduit into the school-to-prison pipeline. In addition, the Education Department and Department of Justice should fully enforce all the provisions of Title IX, Title VI, the ADA, Section 504, and the ADA. The problems that we discovered while putting this report together, almost all of them are violations of current federal laws. So if those laws were better enforced, I think we would see fewer of these problems. There are not a lot of places in which new legislation is needed to solve these problems, just simply enforcement of current legislation. I think the exception would be passage of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, which has really important protections for kids with disabilities, and also the implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which helps prevent the sexual abuse of youth in juvenile justice and adult facilities. So with that, I think I'll close, and I really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to think about these important issues.
All right. So at this time, we'll be taking questions from participants. So if you want to type in your question into the questions box now, if you haven't already done so, we'll take a few moments for questions to be answered or entered. And as you're thinking about your questions, just wanted to remind everybody that the webinar recording, transcript, PowerPoint handouts, and any other additional resources will be posted on CJJ's website within 24 hours. So we'll give it a minute here and let some questions shuffle in here. We've got a question here regarding probation departments, and Diane, I thought I would shoot this one over to you.
Okay.
And the question is, do you know if there are any juvenile probation departments that have their own internal task force that review their service delivery to youth with intellectual or developmental disabilities?
That's an excellent question, because probation departments, being the entry point into the system, can have a lot of power in terms of diverting the youth and providing appropriate community-based services for them. I know that the Models for Change project, which is part of the MacArthur Foundation, does have some really nice descriptions of some model programs, and I know that the Robert F. Kennedy Action Corps has also done some individual work with probation departments. So I would refer you to the Models for Change website. I don't want to say offhand which particular probation departments, because I wouldn't want to leave out any ones that are doing good work, but I would refer you to the Models for Change website.
Okay, another question regarding reentry, Diane. How do you get various agencies involved with young people who are in the juvenile justice system to collaborate and develop reentry plans that truly meet some of the underlying needs that the youth have?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know that there have been some models where communities have been able to pull in, for example, most importantly, I think the public school district, particularly for kids with IEPs, while they are still in the system, by having an assigned caseworker. And I think Leanne, in her presentation, talked about the importance of having a caseworker in the DC model. Having a human being assigned to that youth while they are in the system is one, I think, the most important ways to ensure that the youth have a voice in the system and that other systems are involved as needed, so that they're truly connected when they come out. And again, I think there may be some information on the Models for Change website, but my contact information is on there, and if you don't find it, please do just contact me, because it is, I know that there are some good models out there.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hello? Yes, you can? So this is Leanne, and I would just add to that that some more models are mentioned on the Karen Grau's documentary, which is such a powerful, just such a powerful documentary of showing, you know, the gaps in the system, and she highlighted 2 or 3 programs in that.
Right.
And one of the things that we do through the NCCJD is provide a model that we call disability response teams, where whenever we go in to provide a training, we make sure that we bring in law enforcement, victim advocates, the legal community, along with the disability community and people with disabilities themselves, to really have equal footing into the training. They have equal say into you know, what it is that they feel is important for each other to know. So it's really this cross-systems approach, and it's something that we discovered in doing some crime victims work, just how powerful these multidisciplinary teams are. So I would really encourage looking at that approach, and we have more on how to develop a disability response team. We have a fact sheet on that on our website too that we can provide after the webinar.
Great. So here's another question regarding SROs. Do you have any specific recommendations for training SROs? Should they have to understand their roles when it comes to disabilities? For example, kind of understanding the needs and how to refer young people to the proper service providers.
There are really some excellent models out there for SRO training, and I know that there are a number of PNAs that have done that training, and I'm sure there are others, and I'm sure that Leanne also has some information about that. And I think one of the things that's really important is role clarity. It's not just about training. Training is really important. Making sure that a police officer in a school setting is there to do what a traditional police officer has always done, which is to make sure that the school community remains safe. And I think where problems arise, particularly in the interaction with children with disabilities, is when police officers are being asked, and often against their will, to be the vice principal, to take care of dress code violations and disrespectful language and other things that really have nothing to do with school safety. And so I think it is important that SROs be aware of the needs of youth with disabilities, but I also think that if it appears as though there's a lot of overlap there and there's a lot of interaction, it may well be that there's role confusion and that the officers are being used to do work that honestly has really better done by trained education professionals.
And I would also add to that too, because we recently got, we recently added as a partner at NCCJD the National Association of School Resource Officers, who they were on our last advisory committee partner meeting, and they really, the training that they are providing is more around mental illness. And I don't believe there is enough training going on for youth with IDD. And even locally, where I've been involved in crisis intervention training with police officers, again, that same need came up as to what type of training is provided and how much it impacts the situation when the school resource officers aren't aware of the disability or what kind of accommodations they need to be providing. So we see that as a need that has not yet been met, and we're working with NASRO to meet that.
And when one keeps in mind the training that educational professionals, especially principals and vice principals, receive, you know, they went to school to do this work, and police officers, for the large part, went to the academy to learn a completely different skill set. And so I think one has to be realistic, I think, about how much you can train an officer to do something different from what they have been trained to do, and it can put officers sometimes in an unfair position to ask them to do that.
Okay. So this question is regarding serious violent offenses. And the question is, there are times that young people with intellectual or developmental disabilities commit a serious violent offense, and the participant is wondering if there's any recommendations as to how a system might respond in that type of a situation.
Well, I'm very glad you brought that up, because I think one of the things that happens when we talk about intellectual disabilities, and I think people do still, I think, sometimes have stereotypes about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that they are incapable of committing serious violent offenses, and like all people, they are. And so I think part of the important planning and programming for folks is to keep in mind the complexity and the heterogeneity of the community, that there are many people with intellectual disabilities who don't commit crimes, and just like the rest of us, there are those who do. So I think that making sure that treatment services are available for people who are truly unsafe in the community, so that while they're incarcerated, they're receiving the services that they need, and also the accommodations that they need to address their disabilities, and just to keep in mind that there are disability-related needs of all kinds for people, even those who are in the special housing units or in segregation, in those rare cases where it truly is necessary within like a maximum security facility. And just knowing that those people may be there just as they may be anywhere.
And I would just add to that as well that there is definitely a lack of this type of resources that we've seen as we've been providing information and referral and taking calls from a number, and most of our calls are not victim related, they are suspect offender related. And what we keep coming up against over and over is finding these services, which goes back to the whole story about Justin, of even when there is when there is an offense and that person does need support, what are the options other than going straight into the system, where they often don't get the support they need in terms of their disability being accommodated so that they can actually benefit from that service. So that's something that's very frustrating for families. I'm sure frustrating for professionals who are doing the best they can with the limited resources that they have. But we have to think long term and look at what kinds of research we need to document what kinds of therapies with youth with IDD are working and why, and how can we make sure that those services are provided in our communities.
One very concrete piece, too, is to just keep in mind that any of the programming that the prison provides or the juvenile justice facility provides is available in lower literacy levels, because we've had clients who would access programming but they can't read the materials, and also that that accommodations are made for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, who also may have physical disabilities, to make sure that whatever programming is available in the facility, it's truly available to everybody.
Building off of your response, Leanne, there was a question regarding how to support and prepare parents and families of young people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities and are in contact with the justice system. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some strategies that are being used or could be used to support and prepare families?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and I would refer folks to our white paper that you have as a handout, starting on page 7, where we asked the PACER Center, who's been doing a lot of work in juvenile justice issues, to provide information on that specifically, because that's what they do focus on, is how to support families who are concerned about their youth and what could happen in the criminal justice system. So they actually look at how to be involved in the IAP process, how to ensure that different strategies are spoken about in that, as well as a behavior intervention plan, steps to assist in the community by talking to law enforcement in your community, letting them know about the disability, also with the school resource officers, just helping everyone to be as aware as possible so that when something occurs, it's not a complete shock and surprise. But I just have to say that even when you do that, you know, things can go wrong really quickly. And so it's important to be involved with local disability agencies to sort of build a circle of support around you, your family, your children, so that you have as many contacts as possible if and when a situation like this occurs. And another thing that they brought up and that we're seeing a lot of is online safety. And we've had several cases of males with autism who are being charged for child pornography, and how then they end up on a sex offender registry, definitely, and how it just completely changes their entire lives. So there's so many different caveats here to think about in terms of how to help families be prepared as possible for these things. And again, even when you are, it can still go in the wrong direction, and to have resources like your local chapter of the ARC, Autism Society, National Down Syndrome Society, and then NCCJD, who tries to provide that support for local agencies so that the families aren't completely alone in these situations.
Okay, great. So unfortunately, it looks like we've run out of time today, but I'd like to thank our presenters. And if you'd like to follow up with them, please feel free to reach out to them using the contact information listed here on the slide. This is the first webinar in a series on youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities in juvenile justice. And you can look for another webinar this spring in the series. If you require a certificate of completion for the webinar, or you would like to hear more about CJJ's future webinars, feel free to reach out to Audrey Eisman at the contact information listed there. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us again for this webinar or for future webinars. Thank you again.